Good morning. I want to tell you a story that spans the last 10 years of my life. In 2004, I was a photographer in India when the tsunami hit, and it devastated Sri Lanka. At that time, one of my oldest friends was working in the Vani, which you can see here, circled in the north of Sri Lanka. That area was controlled by the rebel group, the Tamil Tigers, and it was a very sensitive area. And he called me on Boxing Day morning when the tsunami hit and said he wanted some help, some emotional support. And I flew from Delhi down to Colombo and drove up to North Sri Lanka through the government checkpoints, no man's land, and into rebel-held, controlled Tamil Tiger territory. That moment on the 28th of December 2004 changed the course of my life, in the sense that I got to experience a unique area of this world, a place that was controlled by a rebel group that had been fighting a government for about 25 years, that had just been destroyed by a natural phenomenon. And I went there just for 10 days, but I ended up staying there for 4 years. I worked firstly for a Norwegian NGO and then for the United Nations. And this is that 4 years is a big story, but what I really want to focus on is the human tragedy and the human story. To give you a brief background, the government, the Buddhist, predominantly Buddhist government of Sri Lanka had been fighting this protracted war with the Tamil Tigers since the late 1970s. And I found myself in this city called Kilinochchi. It's an incredibly rural area. And over the course of 4 years, it went back into this protracted war. And I started to see firsthand what conflict was about. It wasn't about what I saw on the news or what I'd seen in action films. It was complete tragedy of human cost. And as a photographer, as an anthropologist, as a journalist, I started to photograph and interview civilians that were caught up in this war. Like this boy here, who's the night before his house had been hit by shells, by artillery. His mother had died, and he was completely shell-shocked. He had no idea what had happened, and his house was destroyed. That boy really changed the way I viewed conflict. And I started to kind of follow these communities, photographing them, and understanding how when conflict comes to your doorstep and you have to flee your house, when your house is destroyed, your mother is killed, and you have to jump on a tractor like this and leave your home. You might have some possessions that you can take, you might have some money that you can load up this tractor. But then as the conflict catches up with you more and more, you start shedding your personal belongings and you start fleeing. And a tractor with all of your belongings suddenly turns into a tractor like this, with a whole community on it fleeing. In September 2008, the United Nations evacuated North Sri Lanka, and I was in the last convoy. That day completely devastated me. I'd been in this community for 4 years. I'd got to know people. I'd seen babies being born. I'd gone to weddings. I'd gone to funerals. And suddenly, as a white UN international worker, we were evacuating and leaving our Tamil staff and friends behind in a conflict zone. This was one of the last pictures I took. And it was of people who were completely vulnerable, left under trees with just the shirts, saris, rubber flip-flops. And so, for the next 2 years, I was back in the UK, and I went through some serious kind of mental health issues of a sense of guilt, of a sense of abandonment of people. And every day I was getting emails and messages on Facebook about one of my friends had died, one of my friends had fled. And then suddenly in 2011, survivors of the conflict started to pop up on Facebook, contacting me and saying, I survived, I'm now in London, I'm in Zurich, I'm in Australia, I'm in Cape Town, all over the world. And I realized, conflict, it's not about the bombs and the guns. It continues for a long time afterwards. And these people have been spread all over the world. And so I started to collect their stories. I went and visited them. And I thought, I want to tell their story. People weren't listening to their story. They didn't realize what they had been through on the human level. The media was full of statistics. But these stories had human elements behind them. And so I wanted to tell this story. I had all of these photographs, all of these interviews. So I teamed up with this fantastic illustrator, Lindsay Pollock. And we started going through all of my material and interviewing people. And we started to pull in my Tamil friends and asking them, how can we tell your story? And so we thought, let's do it with comic books. Let's try and engage people through art. And so we started, this was one of the first ones that we looked at, and we were using my photographs and trying to tell this story of this girl, Stella. And comic books have this wonderful way of anonymizing people's faces. So we can use that photograph, it's just her back, but then we draw the rest of her. And this was a turning point in my work, where Lindsay sent me this illustration from one of my photographs, and it was that kind of eureka moment that I thought, wow, we can do this. We can make a comic out of this story, a graphic novel. And so we started using the multimedia of illustrating on photographs to tell that this was a real story. And I wanted to get deeper into that. I realized that there was a responsibility on me to tell these stories in a very ethical and responsible way. So I started it as a PhD in the University of Sussex. And my methodology was kind of working with Lindsay, working out a concept, a chapter of how we were going to tell a story, and then using my position, which is incredibly privileged as a white British male. I have access to these places. People listen to me. They weren't listening to my Tamil friends. So I would go to funding organizations, to media organizations. They would give us money to work and tell these stories. And now we have an organization called Positive Negatives, which goes around the world telling these stories and working with communities to tell their stories. So that's me there sitting under a tree and interviewing a woman about her story. And while I'm there on the ground, I photograph so that the artist can draw from the pictures. And then while I'm there, I write the script of the story from the interviews, and I read the respondent their story, and they get to edit it, and they get a sense of telling their story through our organization. And this is us working in Zaatari refugee camp with Syrian refugees in Jordan, and going through that methodology with them and including them so that they get a real sense to tell their story. And then I come back either to Istanbul or to London, wherever, and we try and work with artists from the regions that we're working with so that the artists get a sense of putting their culture and their nuance into the art. And then the comics go out into the newspapers, mobile phones, computers, and then I come to places like TED and I tell you the story, and then I start again and go to the airport and go somewhere else. And this is the kind of art on the left here that we send back to the respondents. We sit with them and we show them the pencil sketches of what we've drawn. And they get a sense to say, the trees should be a bit bigger or the house should be a bit smaller or whatever, and it's their image, it's their story. And so we can start to really get into the nuances of conflicts and the nuances of storytelling. And on the left here, we've covered things like post-traumatic stress disorder, which is an incredibly difficult and complex issue to get across in storytelling. But through comics, we can see that this guy, Anthony, is falling asleep in his bedsit in London as an asylum seeker, and he's reliving the traumas of his life in his dreams. We can see also in the aeroplane at the top how it's again those subtleties. This guy flew from India to London on a false passport. And what was that like for him? For us, we get on an aeroplane and we move around the world. For him, this journey has cost him $20,000. It might take him 3 months to make this journey from India to the UK. It might take him longer. He won't see his family again, maybe ever, maybe for 3-4 years if he's lucky. And he's traveling there And it's all the subtleties on the aeroplane, like the first time he used knife and fork to eat was on an aeroplane. When he went to the toilet and he pushes the flush button, and it scared him. He's never seen this. It's a completely alien environment for him. And then when he arrives in London and he's walking through an alien environment, and how the media, how the general public portray this character on the streets. And then isolation that he feels here on the right, that he's away from his family, that he's away from his loved ones, he's in this alien environment, and he's cooking by himself, he's eating by himself, he's going through all of these issues by himself with all of that trauma. And we can try and get that out through the art. And we've been working a lot with torture victims. And again, another headline in the newspapers of torture. We're hearing about it all the time. But what's it really like to go through 6 months, 1 year of torture? And so we work with these very, very sensitive issues. And we work with someone who survived torture and sit next to them with their therapist. And we take their stories and we work with them to tell their stories, and then we deliver the art back to them. And they get to see and confront those demons and those memories and those dreams of what they went through. And again, the nuances of being tortured, that again and again the stories came up that while they were being tortured, it was their wife and child or their loved ones that they were thinking about. What happens if I don't make it through this? What happens to them? Sexual violence as well is something that we're trying to tackle as well. What's it like for a woman to go through an experience like this of a domestic maid in Saudi Arabia who is attacked on a daily basis by her employees and is trapped in a household in Saudi where they have her passport and she can't go back? And these are very, very difficult and sensitive topics to tell, but when you anonymize them, when you take them through an artistic process, that this woman, Almaz, can tell her story. And then when you get to Europe, and you're an asylum seeker, you're a refugee, and you're suddenly confronted with stop and search by the police of a Muslim community. You're confronted with a xenophobic media that portrays you as a terrorist or a jihadi or whatever. And how does that make you feel? How does that make you interact with your new environment that's supposedly there to give you safety and shelter? And that sense of identity that we can see in the strip here. Mental health issues as well is something we try and tackle, that, you know, when you've been through a conflict, when you've had to migrate, and you're coming with all of this stress, but you might come from a culture where it doesn't understand mental health issues at all. There is no thing of therapy, of counseling. And so you're living in this new environment, carrying that baggage of weight. And so we work with these communities and tell their stories. And then we have really humorous things as well, where this white family in Finland was living next to a Somali family. And both families were really scared of each other. The Somali woman wore an abaya, and the Finnish guy, he made a cake for her. And he had obviously read a little bit of Arabic, and he goes in, he knocks on her door, and says, I made this cake for you, it's completely haram. And she laughs, and she found that really funny. And suddenly that broke the barrier that this woman in an abaya has a sense of humor. She's not this scary person. And now the children play together. And we can translate comics very easily. So this one of Almaz, the migrant worker in Saudi Arabia, is now in 15 languages. And we translate it into Arabic, Swahili, Somali. We take them to schools, and we can teach children about the dangers of going to the Gulf as a migrant worker, about growing up, about asylum. We test pilot these comics in schools in the UK, and again try and tackle some of the theories and some of the statistics that the students are reading in their textbooks, and delivering those stories as a human story. That it's not about 20,000, it's about someone's daughter, it's about someone's father. And so now we're doing projects all over the world telling stories like this. And what brought me here to Istanbul last year was to try and tell the story of Syria. But again, not about the 2 million Syrians that are now located around this region as refugees, but about the economies of migration. How much does it cost? How do you do it? How does this family leave Dara in Syria and make it to Sweden? How does that journey work? How much does it cost? What do you take with you? What do the children feel? What do they remember? What are their dreams? What are their memories? And so we work with these communities and try and get that story out there through these very, very nuanced details. And now I'm working with a wonderful Syrian artists, and they're telling these stories and helping me draw them and work with the communities. And this is a Syrian elder who was reading one of our Somali comics and found it absolutely hilarious that in our Somali comic, the Somali family, the father was saying the stars in Somalia are the most beautiful in the world. And he found that hilarious because obviously the stars in Syria are the most beautiful in the world. And so he got the comic, he went into the details. And now our Syrian artists are drawing these with the photography and telling these stories. And what I wanted to tell you today, what I wanted to kind of leave you with was, every time I come back here to Istanbul, there are more and more Syrian people I see on the streets, and think about where these people come from. They're not statistics. These people are people's daughters and sons and mothers and fathers. And listen to their stories and try and help tell them to a wider world. Thank you.